setting up Texas before the Great Depression, before 1930, because to understand the massive transition that happens when Texas goes through the Depression, the New Deal, and World War II, you got to understand what came before. So I want to kind of lay that out and give you guys a good kind of quick but effective survey, I think, of Texas from 1900 up until 1930. And, you know, when you get to Texas in 1900, right, they do a census. So this is kind of our starting point for all this stuff. And when they do the census in 1900, there's about 3 million people in Texas, evenly divided between men and women. And what's amazing about that is that that's only 79 years, you can see on the PowerPoint here, that's only 79 years away from 1821 when Stephen F. Austin shows up and Anglo colonization begins. That's only 79 years. My wife's grandmother, who's still alive, is 94, right? This is less than a lifetime of how much time has gone on. And the population increase that's happened in Texas since 1821 is enormous. Like, you guys, when you teach about, you know, when Stephen F. Austin shows up, how many people are there in Texas? Non-Indians, I mean, like not Comanches. There's about 3,000 Spaniards in Texas when Austin shows up, right? 3,000 in 1821 to 3 million by 1900. That's an astounding change. But what's really interesting to me is that a lot of life hadn't actually changed, even though the population had grown so tremendously during that time period. So the vast majority of people kind of still lived the way they did in 1821. They were farmers, the vast majority of Texans. In the 1900 census, there's about 83% of all Texans are farmers, 83%, which means, you know, they live by the sunrise and the sunset. And you spend most of your day doing this, plowing a field, and it's a hard life that depends on the weather. It's not an easy existence, right? So in some ways, by 1900, very little had changed in certain respects. But one thing that had changed is that you did have the growth of cities to a decent amount, right? 17% of all Texans lived in cities of some significance, 2,500 people or more, right? You know, you think of Houston, Dallas exists, Austin, San Antonio was actually one of the biggest, but one of the most important was Galveston, right? And Galveston, this is an image of Galveston in, I think, 1899 or early 1900. And Galveston was a city built on agriculture. It was built on the cotton trade and all the cotton coming out of the rest of Texas and going through Galveston. And Galveston became very big, very important. In 1900, Galveston is the third wealthiest city in the entire United States. It's only second to New York City itself in terms of economic influence in the country. It's incredibly powerful. But it's destroyed in the hurricane of 1900. And you guys know that, right? The biggest natural disaster still in all of American history. Is Galveston just gutted by this? And I always tell my students when I get to 1900, and I talk about the hurricane, I show this image, and I always say it's like the second little pig had built an entire city that got blown down. Like, it's all destroyed. And then Galveston rebuilds. And that's kind of the metaphor I want to give you guys as we start this whole thing, right? In the 20th century, Texas is going to rebuild itself. And it's going to build itself really from the ground up, kind of like Galveston has to build itself from the ground up. And so if you're writing down notes, here's a note I want you to write down at the very beginning. And when you think about the 20th century, what you're thinking about is Texas changing because of urbanization, because of the building of cities, because of all those things happening during the 20th century. It's going to completely transform Texas life from that agricultural base that could go all the way back to 1821 to a much more urban and diversified economy, all right? And so that's going to begin in the early 20th century. The 1930s and 40s, it's going to transform it, but we're going to set this up, all right? And how does that happen? Well, a lot of it's because in 1901, 1 year after the hurricane that destroyed Galveston, they discover oil not terribly far away at a place called Spindle, all right? So our essential question for this first section is, how did the discovery of oil at Spindletop in 1901 begin a slow, and it was slow, but a steady too, transformation of Texas? And the answer is oil produces urbanization, right? That's the shorthand I'm going to give you at the outset. Oil is this catalyst for urbanization in the state of Texas during the early 20th century. And that's going to really transform everything going forward, all right? So let's talk about where this begins. January 10th, 1901. And that's the date. I always have my students write that date down. It's one of those really important dates in Texas history that no one in Texas can remember for some reason. But it's the date that the Spindletop well came in and ushered in a whole new era, not just in Texas history, but really in American history, right? And I'm sure a lot of you guys know the story of Spindletop. I'm going to give you a very thumbnail quick version, but Spindletop was this like big hill formation down in Jefferson County, near modern day Beaumont, Port Arthur, down that area down there, right near the Louisiana border. And there were a couple of guys who seemed to think that there was probably oil deep underneath that salt dome formation down there, but no one was quite sure, no one could quite prove it. And most oil men in the United States did not think there was oil out in Texas, in part because John D. Rockefeller, the guy who owned Standard Oil, controlled 90% of the oil industry, had declared that there's no oil west of the Mississippi, so don't worry about it. But these guys go out there and they drill, and then they drill, and they drill several times. They have to get a new kind of drill bit that can go deeper than anyone's gone before. But on January 10th, 1901, they hit a pocket of oil and gas. The pressure from that pocket blows this, massive release of pressure from the ground that throws 4 tons of drilling equipment out into the air, which would be kind of terrifying that that's going to be raining down on top of you, right? And then, oil gushes out of there at the tune of 100,000 barrels a day. And it does that for 9 whole days before they can even cap it. So think about that. On January 10th, when they hit this thing, 900,000 barrels of oil, nearly 1 million barrels, fly out of the ground before they can even cap this thing and start controlling it. And what they've done is they've proven there's oil in Texas. There's a lot of it down there. And this begins this whole new era in get-rich-quick schemes of drilling oil anywhere they can possibly do it, right? So I love these images of Spindletop taken, basically a year after, at least from 1902, of Spindletop. And you can see they've just got derricks at every 20 feet, right? Petroleum engineering is just being developed and is poorly understood at this point. So they're just sticking straws in the ground everywhere they possibly can to suck as much oil out as they possibly can. And it turns out there's a lot of oil down there underneath the Spindletop strike. And I'll give you a couple of numbers that I think will illustrate this pretty well. I don't throw a lot of numbers at my students because they tend to gloss over with their eyes, but some of these numbers are pretty striking. So these are very effective. So Texas did produce oil before the Spindletop strike, not very much. You can see in 1896, we were putting out a whopping 1,000 barrels of oil every year. But in 1902, 1 year after the Spindletop strike, Texas is producing 21 million barrels of oil every year. I mean, if you're doing a line graph, that's just a straight up line in terms of production, right? It's going way up massively overnight. It produces a massive new industry with a lot of money to be made. I mean, all these wells are bringing in huge amounts of money. The jobs working on these wells are bringing in huge amounts of opportunities for people, usually young men, to have these types of jobs. And then making money off of those young men is a whole other industry around it. They don't just find a strike at Spindletop. Everybody starts drilling everywhere they can around Texas. Every geological formation that looks like it might have a little bit of promise suddenly has, people drilling as best they can on there, doing anything they can to make some wildcat money. And this produces a phenomenon that I like to put up with my students in terms of an equation here, because this is math I can do. But this leads to urbanization because oil plus people desperate for the money they can get from oil equals urbanization. Is people are going to strike oil and then everyone's going to rush to that spot and then they're going to build out the capacity for living there, and suddenly you've got a little town overnight. And I mean like literally overnight. Like there'll be a strike and people would come rushing in to wherever that strike was. Sometimes they're rushing in to put up their own well and buy land next to it and try to make money off of that, make money working for the guys who are doing the drilling itself, make money off of those guys. But what this produced was rapid little town developments all over Texas. And these were just Wild West kind of towns. Like when you think about the Wild West, and you think of like, Dodge City and stuff like that. Like throw that out. In Texas, like the Wild West towns are these oil towns. There's no law, there's no order, there's no nothing. All right, people just come flying in. You got a lot of young men suddenly with a lot of money. And so saloons get set up, people are fighting with each other. There's no town police, there's no mayor. This town sprung up in the middle of nowhere overnight, and people are, falling all over each other trying to get rich. So they'd have jails that are basically, a chain link tied to one tree and to another, and they just tie somebody to it. They'd have, the hotel would be just a bunch of cot tents. People would rent those, by the day or by the half day, or, whatever could be possible. So oftentimes Texas, the state of Texas had to send in the Texas Rangers just to restore order in these places, as, things kind of came off at the hinges and at the wheels everywhere. And my point in telling you all of it, all right, if you're taking notes again, is to emphasize that striking oil produced this like boom for drilling oil, which created cities, which created problems. Like these cities are not model places to live. And so when these cities create all these problems, there's an effort to, we got to figure out a way to solve these problems. We need someone to pick up the trash in these cities. We need let's have some police officers so that they can arrest ruffians when they're getting drunk at the local saloon now. Like, let's put some order on this chaos, right? That's what people are moving toward in the early 20th century in Texas. And that kind of dovetailed pretty nicely with a movement that was going on across the whole United States. Because while Texas is having an urban boom because of oil towns, there are rapid urbanization growing of cities in lots of parts of the United States. And this caused problems not just in Texas, but in places like New York City. So I love this image. This is not a color photograph. This was colorized later, but this image of a street in New York. You can get a sense of I don't know, the vibrancy of it. It's just so rich, and I use it a lot with my students. It works really well. But when you look at these cities, I will tell you, there's very little city planning. There's very little organization, and these places were pretty nasty to live in. They had, no sewage treatment. They had very little in the way of taking care of human waste or animal waste or things like that. People got, diseased as a result very frequently. Disease would run rampant through water supplies. While it looks beautiful in this picture, if you got in a time machine and went back there, if you open the door of the time machine, which if you've ever taken anything with me, and my mantra is never get the time machine. The past is a terrifying place. But if you did, and the door opened, the DeLorean, and you come out, you would just be knocked over with this wave of stench that would knock you back. Living conditions in these places were nowhere close to anything you'd want to live in. These places with no air conditioning, at all, but no ventilation is what I mean. No safety codes. It'd be these massive buildings that are tenement housing, apartment buildings essentially, that have one bathroom for the entire place and one spigot of water that's right next to the toilets. So everybody's constantly getting cholera and things like that, and dysentery, and you're sick all the time. It's just really gross, right? And I think this image right here, again, is a very powerful one for a lot of reasons, but I think it demonstrates most clearly just the problem with cities and how nasty they were. This horse just died in the city, in the street, and no one's picking him up because there's no standardized sanitation commission that's going to come in and pull that stuff out. These kids are just playing next to a dead horse. And that dead horse would probably rot there for a long time, and that would get in the water system, and you can imagine, all right? So I think I've sufficiently grossed you out. I'll stop now. But my point in all of this is that there are problems in cities across the United States. In Texas, are tied to oil towns. In New York, it's this. In Boston, in Philadelphia, in Charleston, right? In all these different places, in New Orleans. This produces a movement in the United States called progressivism that I know you guys talk about, I know you guys teach about, and the teachers say we need to talk about this. But progressivism is this movement that comes out of this period that's basically a reaction to all these problems that come with cities. And the idea of progressivism is we need to clean up this mess and we need to do something about this. Maybe we should have clean water. Maybe we should have some way of dealing with dead horses in the street. Maybe we should improve the situation in people's lives in these different cities. Progressives are worried and concerned about all those things, and they want to use, this is something, again, if you're taking notes, it's important to write down, they want to use the power of government to solve these problems, right? So they're putting their faith in the idea that city governments, local governments, but also state and federal governments eventually can deal with these kinds of problems. And progressives are especially focused not just on cleaning up cities, but also protecting the people that they think are the most vulnerable to these problems. So the progressives were especially focused on protecting women. So these are women working in factories up in the Northeast in various points. They were also focused, the progressives were also focused on trying to protect children because they're the most vulnerable members of society. So let me introduce you to the cast you're seeing right here. These are coal miners. These little boys are coal miners, which coal mining is still one of the most dangerous jobs you can possibly have. These guys would go down to the mine. I can't even fathom what that would have been like. Okay? And you're saying to yourself, well, that's coal mining or factory work. That's not going to be in Texas. Well, Texas did have cotton mills, and people-owned cotton mills love to hire children too because they have small hands and they can get inside these machines while they're still running. Because if you got a spool knocked off your machine, you don't want to turn that thing off. My goodness, no. You need to get an 8-year-old up there who can stick the little hands in there and put the spool back on. Maybe they lose a finger, maybe not. But this is an era before anything like that's going to be a problem. There's no child labor laws. There's no OSHA. There's no regulation. There's no minimum wage either. You can pay these kids virtually nothing. And because they're starving or their families are starving, they're going to have to take those jobs. So progressives are trying to solve all those kinds of problems. And one of the ways they're trying to solve those problems, which will be important to Texas, is they want to empower women and give them the right to vote. So the giving women suffrage, the suffrage movement, giving women the right to vote was a big part of how progressives hope to protect women, to protect children, because they believe women would be better, they would vote more likely to protect children than men would, and to clean up cities in general, because they felt that women were more attuned to these sort of problems because they and their children had to live in them. So they were very focused on giving women the right to vote. The progressives were also focused on another issue that'll be important in Texas, which is outlawing alcohol. And so they were very focused on trying to outlaw liquor and beer and all sorts of stuff, as we can see right here, because once again, they thought that would be good for cleaning up problems in cities, for protecting women and children, because drunk men cause problems, was their argument. And so they're focused on those things. Now, progressivism comes to Texas because of a lot of reasons. We already had cities, but the oil boom in particular accelerates that dramatically. And so these oil towns are just nasty, terrifying things. And so that brings progressivism into the state fairly quickly. It's actually banning alcohol that gets the most support in a lot of parts in Texas at the very beginning when progressivism comes to the states. When you talk about progressivism, you talk about in Texas, outlawing alcohol is one of the biggest things that they latched onto, in part because these oil boom towns always have young men and saloons. We're talking about problems that are emerging. It's young men getting drunk at these saloons and causing issues in town that a lot of the progressives in Texas are focused on. And so they make an effort to outlaw, progressives do, alcohol across Texas, and they have a statewide vote in 1911. Which I just want to point out to you guys, 1911, that's literally a decade, 10 years after Spindletop. That's how quick an effect there has been the discovery of oil, that only 10 years later, now there's a national state vote about whether or not to outlaw alcohol in Texas because of all the problems that then came with these oil boom towns. You can see the vote numbers are pretty close. There's only 6,000 vote difference here. Booze stayed legal by a razor thin margin right here, but you can see Texas is pretty evenly divided amongst its voters between those who are now a part of this new progressive movement and this old school side that's not as interested in such things, if that makes any sense. That's how quickly progressivism comes to Texas and how powerful and pervasive its influence really was, right? And we can see that across the state because in 1914, there's a guy who we're going to see a lot of today named James Ferguson, who is elected governor of Texas in 1914. You probably heard of James Ferguson. He went by the name Farmer Jim sometimes. He'll later be known as Pa of Ma and Pa Ferguson. But in 1914, no one knew who this guy was. He was an unknown, showed up from nowhere. He's not a politician. He'd been a banker before this and made a decent amount of money doing banking stuff. But in 1914, he decided he wanted to be governor of Texas. Who wouldn't? And when he ran for governor, he recognized this split in Texas politics and how the progressives were a big deal now. And so he ran for governor by promising Texans some very progressive things, while also promising some kind of old school things for the other Texans. So on the one hand, Ferguson opposed some things that were very progressive and very common amongst progressives. So giving women the right to vote was something he was actually against, which is going to be ironic later when his wife runs for governor in the 1920s. And he was also against outlawing alcohol. So these two kind of flagships of the progressives, Jim Ferguson was against. But Ferguson was interested in using the power of the state government to improve people's lives, which is a very progressive idea. And so he proposed, when he was campaigning, to use the state government to help farmers by getting involved in making sure they weren't getting cheated on their land, and by paying for more state education, which is not something the state of Texas had really invested in up until this point with any significance. Since we're a group of teachers right here, I thought that's a fun little factoid that it's not until 1914 that they're really talking about using state money to really pay for public education in any way. It's James Ferguson that's pushing that idea. So Ferguson pushes that, and he pushes these like progressive ideals, and that's what separates him from his competition. And so he gets elected in 1914 as governor of the state of Texas by promising to do things on the progressive movement side of it, right? And so my point here in saying this is that oil had started changing a lot of things. It had changed urbanization, it had changed aspects of the state, but it was also changing the state's politics in powerful enough ways to get a certain man elected to governor in 1914. We can see this kind of even more powerfully in 1918 when there's a woman named Annie Webb Blanton here who is elected superintendent of education in the state of Texas. And it's a landmark moment because she was the first woman elected to statewide office, and it happened in 1918. And this is because the progressives had gained so much strength by 1918 by saying that they wanted to give women the right to vote and empower women and clean up these cities and all that sort of stuff. Annie Webb Blanton was elected superintendent of education across the state of Texas. That's a big pivot moment. And I will emphasize, and something else we'll get a chance to talk about later, that Texas is at the forefront of giving women the right to vote in the South. It will become the first Southern state to ratify the 19th Amendment when that's passed in 1919, giving women the right to vote in national elections, right? Now, let me pivot for a second here. We got to talk about Ferguson because he's going to show up again later. So James Ferguson, when he becomes governor, does what he says he's going to do and tries to pass those laws favoring Texas farmers and education in the state. But he also decides to, as governor, to enrich himself. And so James Ferguson, he goes on to embezzle state funds to the tune of at least $150,000. Still not sure exactly where some of that money went, but in 1917, the state of Texas started investigating him, and he got put on trial. He was impeached, which is to say put on trial. And then he was found guilty on 10 charges of basically corruption. And he was removed from office. He's the only governor of Texas ever thrown out of office. And when he was thrown out of office, they told him, all right, you're done, and you can never be governor of Texas again. They said you can never hold statewide office. So hold on to that one for a second. That's going to matter a little bit later. Anyway, so he's thrown out of office, but progressivism continues from there. And at the end of his term, so he's thrown out in 1917, that's about the time that we get involved in World War I as well. And so Texas throws itself into the fight for World War I. And we could talk about that all by itself, but for this, what we're talking about here, the important thing to know is that World War I kind of accelerated that process that oil towns had created of urbanization. There's new military plants, but military bases. I'm sorry, I forgot that word for a second. Military bases established in the state that also become little towns and help kind of increase this urbanization by creating some new jobs. So much so that Texas is far more urbanized by 1920 than it had been in 1900. So I'm going to pause there. I'm going to hand this over to my colleague, Jay Ferguson, who's going to walk you through some resources for taking some of this material into the classroom. So I'm going to pause there and hand it over to Jay.
All right, thank you very much. Make sure I'm not on mute. I might have a tendency to mute myself by accident. So kind of going through this unit, I've come up with a couple of things. One item I use, the lesson plan it will be posted inside of the chat. It's also in Google Classroom for you as well too. I want to present my screen. All right, here we go. So this first activity, it's a fun activity that I put my kids through. I treat this in the lesson plan as a hook exercise. It honestly is a little bit bigger than a hook exercise. So keep that in mind. I could turn this into a regular 55-minute class period with no problems whatsoever. There's a lot of segues that I take and go through, but this really is, Michelle and I have something similar. We both had two different versions of it. So I've kind of morphed both of what we've gone through into a little bit of it. I'm not going to go through the full presentation with you, but it's really just talking about industrialization, urbanization with the Texas flair. We've got some learning objectives. We've also got some new terms. What is urbanization, industrialization? I spend some time talking about the boom to bust cycle. And then eventually we get into the rules of the game. I've provided you with a printable version of a graph paper. I have graph paper in my room. I use not the super small ones, but the average size graph paper. What the students are actually going to do is you present each one of these items, they're going to be tracing various squares. It's their choice where they want to put it. But they're really going to be tracing it. And the idea behind this activity is to frustrate your students, to show them what happens with this boom cycle and then the bust. Granted, this takes decades to occur in situations, but it's a fun activity. So they start to build their community on a piece of grid paper. And again, you can take this and morph this for whatever you want to do. My own personal version that I have, where I live in Central Texas, the grocery store is HEB. So I say, hey, draw one HEB 3x3 squares and label it HEB. You'll see Dell, I have Dell in here, I have Samsung in here. But again, you can go back through all this and change to meet your own local needs. That's kind of the fun activity of it. And it kind of goes step by step, and you keep going through this step by step by step. And then we start to see slowdown, and then they start to have to erase things. And then you kind of go through a little bit more of a bust cycle and you erase it again. Oh, now we're back on a recovery. So it's that up and down that we've all experienced as adults, what the economic cycle is all about. So this, again, this is a fun activity. At the conclusion of the activity, I have a story of a little small Texas town called Desdemona. I used to actually go to school at Cisco Junior College and wasn't too far from Desdemona. Been there, and it really is a ghost town. But it kind of gives you some ideas of what it used to look like. This is where the oil boom really occurred. We see Tom Dees and the Hog Creek Oil Company come in and strike it rich. And then ultimately we start to see things take a turn to the south. Only a couple of years, the oil boom, and then ultimately everything has to leave. And these are actually images from Desdemona themselves that I was able to pick up from. And then the other idea that I wanted to talk about was spend some time talking about the impact of oil. Took a little bit of the commentary that Dr. Torget provided, but also spent a little bit of time in researching Spindle for myself, and just really kind of give some background, just kind of what Dr. Torget talked about as background information, a little bit about discovery of oil. These primaries or these sources of information come from area newspapers throughout Texas. So this gives us a fresh account of what somebody is seeing and what's going on with this discovery of oil. So I kind of spend some time, not so much on the discovery piece, because, yes, we have to talk about it, but I also get in there and spend some time on the speculation piece, land speculation. That was the most fascinating. This newspaper that I was able to go through had a ton of information. And I love this story here, to where a guy up before Spindletop decides or wants to sell his property. He can't get $150 for it for 3 years. And when Spindletop is discovered, he sells it for $20,000. The guy who bought it from him turns around and sells it for $50,000. It's just crazy, the land speculation to it. So the idea behind this would be to get my students to understand what speculation is. We talk about it a little bit when we talk about the precursor to the revolution, people coming over for land speculation. So this kind of helps do a good tie back into it. And then we have some news, and these are actual accounts from the newspapers of individuals who have decided to just leave their regular job and get involved with this land speculation component as well too. And then I found another San Antonio Express newspaper that kind of talks about, or spends some time discussing the fast growing city of San Antonio, as well as an activity looking at the growth of business. And some of these businesses are really kind of interesting. The highest producing or grossing business would be the breweries in San Antonio in 1913, which I thought was kind of interesting. And then the exit tickets, always want to bring in the education piece of it. This ties back to Lamar. I found this little bit of this story background from the oil in Texas and cultural history. And I like the idea about, I didn't get into the conversation about UT was getting all this money and A&M didn't get any until much later. But I don't think our children know that we hear Father of Texas, but he actually convinced the Texas legislature to really set aside lands. Then when UT opens, more lands are set aside. And then we know the story, the Santa Rita, the oil is discovered, money starts flowing, UT completely changes. And then we start to see A&M system and UT systems falling underneath this funding system. But even when I did my research, I did not realize this was the largest university endowment in the world, that both universities were able to tap into. And then I bring a little bit of information about the public or the permanent school fund, and talking about that the state pays us for that ADA attendance that we have to do. So attending school does pay. So that was kind of my idea of what I wanted to, bring to you guys. We all have our textbooks, we have our resources, we have everything out there that we typically use. And I thought, all right, what can I do differently? And when I started getting into these newspaper articles, I felt like that was a different look, because that's coming from that era. These are people talking about what's going on, what they're seeing. So I felt like I was able to bring a little bit of the age of oil, discovery, speculation kind of goes off, but it does talk about the what people are going through during that era, and then as well as wrapping it up with the public education and oil. So that is my portion of it, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Torget at this point.
Thank you, Jay. That's awesome. I love the primary source stuff that you brought in. And I think that you guys fill that survey for Humanities Texas ahead of this, and we've tried to respond to that as much as possible. And a lot of what you guys talked about is needing content and needing sources that you guys can access and bring in, and having those in a form that you can take directly into the classroom. So I'm glad that Jay and Michelle, as you'll see in a little bit, are able to bring stuff together so beautifully. All right, so I'm going to go back to my story I've been telling and take the story forward from there. So we've brought it up essentially to 1920, all right? And it's a fast and furious survey because we're trying to cover, quite a bit of ground here to set up big changes that happened in the Depression and the New Deal and World War II. But the 20s is something that's really misunderstood in both Texas and I think nationally, because that urbanization that oil made possible had some really big effects on the state. One of the things it did is that all that urbanization caused a lot of nervousness amongst average Texans. And so as a result of that, that opens the door to the Ku Klux Klan coming into Texas in a really big way and actually setting up their national headquarters in Dallas, Texas, as we're going to talk about here. So I want to talk a little bit about social consequences of all that urbanization and what life was like in the 1920s by the time we get to the eve of the Great Depression. All right. So our second essential guiding question is, why did Texas become the headquarters of the Ku Klux Klan during the 1920s? I'll give you a hint, it's because of urbanization. And how did the economic boom of the 20s continue to reshape the Texas economy? That's going to be oil, and it's going to shape things in big ways right up until the eve of the Great Depression. All right. So by the time we get to 1920, all right, things have changed in Texas and they changed in the whole United States. So what's amazing is that when we do the census of 1920, we do that census, the United States for the very first time in all of its history is a majority urban nation. The United States is 52% living in urban places, like this is New York City, you're seeing right here, all right? Texas is not there yet. Texas will not become majority urban until after World War II, but it gives us a sense of just how far things have come, and that Texas has been catapulted ahead in its urbanization during this entire period, right? Here's the thing. The progressives in the 19 teens in particular were really successful in cleaning up these cities. It's not perfect, but they do amazing things. They've got clean water, they've got sewage systems, dead horses in streets get picked up and cleaned up now. It's a much nicer place to live. And there's a lot of things in cities now by 1920 that you can't get anywhere else. There are movie theaters. The average American, the average Texan, theoretically, but I think Texas is probably a little behind on this, but the average American went to 20 movies a year on average in the 1920s. They were popular, they were exciting, and they depended on electricity and all these amazing things, but you could go to these places and see these movie theaters if you lived in cities. If you lived in cities, you had access to other things electricity make possible. These amazing machines that can do things. This is a hairdryer. I love showing this to my class. Show this to your students and have them guess what it is. I do that all the time, and my college students very rarely figure out what's going on here. But there's 15 machines here drawing this poor woman's hair. But that's a marvel of its time. You can do that, right? You can buy a vacuum to suck up the dirt in your house. How amazing is that? Right? It's actually, I think the name Eureka is appropriate. These felt like miracles for their times, and they're available, but basically in cities, because that's the places that had electricity and large enough populations where they could really support buying this kind of stuff. You can get a washing machine. Look at this, Acme washing machine. And I love the tagline here at the bottom. Let electricity do the hard work for you. Because washing your clothes by hand is really hard work. You just basically beat up your clothes. That's how you do it, right? With soap, you just smack them around and hope that's cleaning it up. And that was an enormously time-consuming thing, but you could, in a city, own things like that. You could have a radio. Radio blows up in the 1920s. It's this whole new form of entertainment. It's amazing. You can buy a radio from the Radio Corporation of America, RCA, and have access to all that stuff and hear stories and programming from all over. It felt like living in an age of wonder in many ways, right? You have cars that are replacing horses as modes of transportation, mainly because this guy, Henry Ford, decided to embrace assembly lines as a way of making cars so he could do it faster, bring down the price, more people could buy them. That, by the way, helped clean up cities because you had a lot fewer horses in cities. I don't know if you know this, but horses poop a lot. I mean, they poop a ton, literally. And so you had these health crises in big cities where there's just so much horse manure, they don't know what to do with it. Well, the car is like this environmental marvel because it doesn't poop. So therefore, you don't have to deal with that manure on that scale. And it actually means for cleaner drinking water, cleaner air. It just is a much more pleasant place to be. And so by the time you get to the early 1920s, you have a lot of Texas cities and towns that are bigger and they're more clean and they're much more pleasant. And so here's a nice cityscape in Texas, or townscape, I should say. These places were suddenly really attractive. Young people in particular, right? Young people would look at this and go, that looks like a lot of fun. There's movies, there's radio, there's all kinds of opportunities. Cities would empower people. They were empowering to young people, particularly young women by the time you get to the 1920s, which young women had also been empowered and politicized to an extent because of the progressive movement, because of the effort to give women the right to vote. And young women started moving to these cities, not in large, massive numbers, but in significant and meaningful numbers, because there's a lot of fun stuff to do in cities, but there's also opportunities to get away from the watchful eye of your parents and your family. And you can reinvent yourself in a city where nobody knows you. You can have anonymity. And that can be a very powerful thing. And so you look at this line of young women, and this is the era of the flapper and all of that. What you're seeing is empowered young women who are excited about their future, who feel like they can get away from the watchful gaze of their parents or whoever's on the farm, and maybe reinvent themselves and have a life that wouldn't have been possible if you're, again, back in some rural part of Texas. Right? My point is, these cities look very exciting to some people, particularly young people, but it's always the dark side. These places also look terrifying and quite scary to other people, usually people who were still on the farm, usually older Texans, who looked at these cities and all that was going on and said, I think those things, those city things are kind of ruining everything. And so change is scary to a lot of folks. And this was no exception. So as Texas is rapidly urbanizing, there's a group of Texans who are watching that and getting really nervous and saying to themselves, I don't know if this is a good thing. And they look at all this and say, I don't know if I want young women empowered, running around with no one watching them, especially with cars, because cars are unsupervised rooms that are driving every which way they can possibly go. You can't keep an eye on them. You can't control them. That was scary to people. There's also a lot of drinking going on in these cities, which would have been true anyway, but it takes on an unusual twist because there's also, this is the era of prohibition. This is one thing the progressives had done, is they'd outlawed alcohol. But that, of course, didn't stop anybody from actually drinking. So alcohol just went underground, and this is the era of the speakeasy and things like that. As you can see, this is an underground party going on. There's a band over here, a bunch of bartenders. No one here is hiding their face from the camera. In fact, this guy here in the middle seems to be having just the best time of all, right? But if you're not in the city and you're reading about this in the newspaper, this could sound scary. This could sound like, sin run amok kind of a thing, right? Especially because what's supplying these things are illegal booze dealers who are making liquor illegally, making beer illegally, and supplying that. Busting these things would be, big news, and they'd show up in Texas newspapers all over the state. And if you're reading this back on the farm, it made cities sound really scary, like places of great danger and crime and things like that. Texas newspapers were also carrying stories of bootlegging and crime that happened outside of Texas. This is the era of Al Capone, which, by the way, I just want to make this very clear, and I say this to my students all the time. Al Capone was just a thug. It's the romanticization of Al Capone needs to stop. He's just a big gangster thug who was a terrible dude and incredibly horrific. But he would show up in your newspapers in the 1920s in Texas. You would hear about what's happening in Chicago, and that would scare you, especially if you're not someone who goes to the cities like Dallas or Austin or San Antonio or things like that. The early 20s is also a period of massive immigration into the United States. This is right after World War I, and you have a lot of war-torn Europe. I mean, really war-torn Europe. People trying to escape that and come to the United States. You also have people escaping Russia and the Bolshevik Revolution. And so in 1920, there's probably, I think it's about 430,000 immigrants who come to the United States. That's in 1920, 430,000. And then the next year, 1921, there's over 800,000 immigrants who come to the United States. A lot of them come through New York, and we talk about Ellis Island, but a lot of them come through Galveston. Galveston is the Ellis Island of Texas and the Southwest, and lots of people are coming in. Big immigration always brings a scare. That's, going back to the Irish in the 1840s. There was fears about immigration then. There's fears about immigration now. This is a theme, and this created a lot of fear because where are those immigrants going? Typically to cities, typically to places like Galveston, Houston, Austin, San Antonio, things like that, right? So my point in all this is to simply say that rapid urbanization opened up opportunities and excitement with some folks, but it also scared the Bodangs out of a lot of other people. In fact, a large number of Texans, again, more rural Texans, usually older Texans, who said to themselves, someone needs to get some order on all this. Somebody needs to bring back morality that seems to be lost in all these cities. Who could possibly step in and provide that kind of order? Well, that's where the Klan comes back in. This is a door that's opened to the Ku Klux Klan to revive itself after it died during Reconstruction. And I know when you guys talk about Reconstruction, I'm sure you guys talk about the Ku Klux Klan and its kind of first stage during the 1860s and early 1870s before it kind of gets stamped out. That Klan during Reconstruction is a very different Klan than this one in the 1920s. I want to make that very clear. The Klan of Reconstruction is a very loose band of basically ex-Confederates who are mad they can't vote anymore. So they turn to terrorism, essentially, to accomplish what they're not able to do by voting anymore. And so the Klan of the 1860s and 70s is just a loose band of very angry guys on horseback who are trying to scare people into not voting and to scare Republicans out of places like Texas. The 1920s Klan is just a whole new Klan, right? They have the same name, they wear the same goofy outfit, but they're a very different group. And I like to call them equal opportunity haters, because the Klan of the 1920s had a much bigger vision of what they thought was good and what they thought was bad. And what the Klan of the 1920s is responding to is this unease that morality is getting out of hand in these cities, and they're here to fix things and to make them safe again for what they call real Americans. So the Klan of the 1920s had 3 criterion that you had to match. And if you did, they say you're good. They say you're a real American and you can live in this city or whatever you want, you'll be okay. But if you're not all 3 of these things, the Klan does not like you, all right? So the first thing you had to be is you had to be Caucasian, you had to be white, right? Anglo-American. You had to also be Protestant. So it's not enough just to be Christian, all right? They do not like Catholics. They don't like Mormons too. They want you to be Protestant, all right? And so you had to be white, Protestant. That's not enough. You also need to be a native of the United States, which they call themselves Native Americans, which it gives me a giggle simply because that term is used for a different way now. But if you are all 3 of these things, the Klan thinks you're a real American and you're good. If you're not all 3 of these things, you're not a real American. You're Mexican, you're African American, you're Irish maybe, and you're Catholic, you're Italian and you're Catholic. You're any of those things, you shouldn't be here, is what the Klan says, right? So the Klan comes roaring to life in the 1920s selling this message. And they come to Texas in 1920, right? They come to Houston, actually. That's the first place that the Klan goes when it comes back to Texas. And they start recruiting members, and the Klan message spread very rapidly in Texas. And Texas was very receptive to it, in large measure because of all of these boom towns and the chaos they created. No matter what the progressives had cleaned up, it still seemed like scariness in a lot of ways. And so the Klan was saying, we're going to put order on things in a way that apparently nobody else will. And so the Klan quickly recruited lots of people. In fact, the Klan did so well in Texas that they decided, this is a Klan march, by the way, I'm right here, that's happening this is in Dallas, right? And the Klan did so well in Texas that they moved their national headquarters to Dallas, Texas. And they made this guy, the picture you're seeing right here, this guy name is Hiram Wesley Evans. And they made him the Imperial Wizard, whatever that means, of the Ku Klux Klan. It's like the top guy, their version of president, whatever. He's the Imperial Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. And Texas becomes the epicenter of the 1920s Klan, all right? That's how dislocating this rapid door for the Klan to come back. But the Klan wasn't just big in Texas. It was big across the United States, particularly the South, to the whole United States. And we know this because they kept open records on how many people were Klansmen. And by the early to mid 1920s, there's 5 million members of this new Ku Klux Klan. And you can see right here, they made a show of that. This is them parading down Pennsylvania Avenue to demonstrate. They're waving American flags. So they're saying that, white Caucasians who are native to the United States are the real Americans, and everybody else should get out. And they're saying this is what Americanism is. They want to hold it up. And so this Klan is different from the 1870s Reconstruction version in a lot of ways. But one really key way is that this version of the Klan is not hiding in the shadows. Their faces out and open, and they're saying, "Yeah, I'm here." And they're not trying to get around the political system. They're using it. The reason these guys are marching on Pennsylvania Avenue is because they want to gain political power. They want to elect people to office and then use that to pass laws that will support the people they think are real Americans, those three criterion, and get rid of everybody else. Okay? And Texas is going to be their home base for doing it. So the Klan sets up its headquarters in Dallas. Its Imperial Wizard, who was a dentist from Dallas. And they decide to use Texas as their test bed for trying to get into political power and political office. So the Klan decides to run somebody for United States Senate from Texas. There was an open Senate seat in Texas opening up in 1922. And they run this guy, the picture you're seeing right here. His name is Earl B. Mayfield. Earl Mayfield. And he's going to run as the candidate the Klan is backing. So they call him the Klanidate. That was what he was called, the Klanidate for office. He is running openly as a Klansman to be a senator from Texas, right? You can imagine, if you're depressed about your options in any election, just imagine 1922 in Texas. The guy who's running for Senate is an open professed Klansman, and he thinks that's going to get him elected. Who could run against this guy? Who would dare stand up against the Klan in Texas? People ask, who could stand up at this moment? Then they hear a voice from the past rise up and say, I'll do it. I'll run against him. And Jim Ferguson shows back up here. Farmer Jim Ferguson shows up again and says, I'll run for office. I'll run against him. And then all the Texans go, now hold on. We just impeached you like 5 years ago. And we said, you can never hold office in Texas again. Jim Ferguson says, oh yeah, that's right. You did say that. Here's the thing. This isn't a state office. This is a federal office. So you can't prevent me from running for the United States Senate. And so all the people in Texas go, oh yeah, dang it. He's got us on that one. So here's the election in 1922. On one side, you have the Klan-backed candidate, Earl B. Mayfield, versus the former disgraced governor who was the only one ever impeached, Jim Ferguson, and then thrown out of office. Those are your two options, right? That didn't look too good. So they go back and forth. It's kind of, it would be hilarious if it wasn't so serious. Ferguson goes around the state making fun of the Klan by calling the Imperial Wizard the Grand Wizard. But in any case, the election comes in, and guess who wins? It is the Klan. Klan wins, all right? Earl B. Mayfield is elected senator from Texas by calling himself a Klansman, right? That's how much this effect has had and how much grip the Klan has on Texas, right? And so by the mid-1920s, as I said, they've got 5 million members and they're moving forward and they're trying to build out even more support. Women, by the way, we're also in the Klan and we're allowed in, and you can see these ladies here are not hiding their faces in any way, shape, or form. But it also turns out that women were a part of bringing down the Klan in Texas. I always think that's a really interesting aspect of this. See, when the Klan got into power, they also did some of their shenanigans from Reconstruction, which is, they would go up and beat up people. That's the way that they enforced things. And so the Klan, when they took over a town like Dallas or Waco, which they were basically infiltrating in these places, they would come in and anybody they didn't like, they would go beat up. And that would be, people who were Catholic or African Americans or Mexican Americans. They go beat them up. But they also started targeting the white middle class. And that was their downfall. Because what they would do is they would come in and someone who had been accused of being immoral, maybe you were accused of cheating your customers at your store. They'd go to your store and drag you out in the street and beat you up in front of everybody and tar and feather you. Or women, middle-class women who are accused of cheating on their husbands. The Klan would show up at their house, drag them out of the house, and do the same thing. Beat them up, whip them in some cases. It's terrible stuff. Well, when they did that to white middle class people, they lost the support of the white middle class for the Klan because they scared the white middle class very, very badly. And so the reason they scared the white middle class is if the Klan comes and beats you up, what are you going to do about it? You can't go to the police. I mean, you could go to the police, but the police is probably infiltrated with Klansmen. And if you take it to trial, like you accuse somebody, 12 people on a jury, a couple of those are going to be Klansmen. So the Klan seemed to operate outside the normal rules of law and order in a way that started scaring the white middle class. So the white middle class began to abandon the Klan. And we know this because the Klan tried to capitalize even more in Texas on politics by electing a governor in 1924. So this is 2 years after their success with Earl B. Mayfield. And they try to elect this guy, his name is Felix Robertson, who is the candidate for the governor of Texas. He's an open, he's from Dallas too. I'm the candidate for governor because I am part of the Ku Klux Klan. Please vote for me. So once again, Texas voters have the opportunity to vote for a Klansman. Now for the governor of Texas. Who, I ask you, could stand up against the Klan in this case? Who would dare step forward at this moment and help Texas? They look around and they wait for somebody, and then a voice pops up again from the past. And Jim Ferguson comes forward again and says, I'll run for governor. And they say, no, you can't do that, Jim. We literally threw you out of that office. This is exactly what we said you couldn't do anymore. And it's a state office. You cannot be governor anymore. We fired you. And James Ferguson goes, oh yeah, that's right. You did fire me. Well, actually, it's not me. I don't want to run for governor. It's my wife, Miriam Ferguson. She's the one who wants to run for governor. Now, 49-year-old Miriam had never run for office, never been involved in politics, never done any of that stuff, but suddenly she just can't wait to be governor of Texas. And so, it's a farce, kind of. Miriam's coming out there and she's running for governor. And when she came out to run for governor, she'd have a campaign event and she'd come out and she'd say, thanks for coming out, for listening to me. I'm running for governor of Texas. And here to tell you why you should vote for me is my husband, Jim Ferguson. All right. And Jim would get out there, James Ferguson. So they became known as Ma and Pa Ferguson. They had this whole little shtick. And, you're voting for Ma, but you're kind of also voting for Pa. Like Pa's hiding over here in the corner doing his thing as a part of this, right? This did make national news because Ma Ferguson if she was elected, was going to be the first woman in any state in the United States to be elected governor in her own right. And so this made national news. The New York Times covered it. It was a big to do. But most of the election came down to a couple of issues, one of which was the Ku Klux Klan. And enough Texans had turned against the Klan by 1924 that they voted for the Fergusons and not for Felix Robertson. So the Klan collapses in Texas by the mid 1920s as a result of this, right? And so the Fergusons get into office. They pull more shenanigans. We could talk about that for its own little hour. We're going to set that aside. But the Fergusons get into office, and Texas goes forward in the 1920s. Now, throughout the rest of the 1920s, what I want to emphasize is that urbanization continued, and it continued to grow as Texas continued to strike oil in various places. And so the 20s was this kind of split experience in Texas where I'm sure your students have heard of the Roaring 20s, and we talk about like the big party aspect of how things are going. And I think I read, The Great Gatsby, I think in middle school, it might have been early high school, but that's about this sort of period and the great opulence of some of that. But that wasn't true for a lot of Texans. You got to remember, most Texans are still farmers. And so the 1920s for them was mostly a period where cotton prices went up and then cotton prices went down. And then cotton prices went up and they went down. They did this like big jumping seesaw kind of action. So the times were better and then they were worse. And they were better and they were worse. So it was not a steady rise for Texas farmers. And that's the vast majority of Texas. But there is something that's happening in the Texas economy that's really important, which is that we've struck more oil. And this is the thing about the 1920s that's amazing, is that you guys have heard of the Permian Basin, right? Midland, Odessa, places like that. That's when we find this oil around 1920. We strike oil out in the Permian Basin. It's a massive amount of oil. And then Texas oil production rises dramatically throughout the 1920s. So much so that by the late 1920s, Texas is producing nearly 20% of the entire world's oil supply. Just think about that for a second. The world's oil supply, that's a massive amount. And it matters because that means that oil is now steadying the Texas economy, right? Up until this point, the Texas economy kind of rose and fell with cotton. And you guys talk about the populist movement, right? That's a bunch of angry cotton farmers who are mad that cotton prices keep dropping. Well, now oil is starting to prop up the Texas economy in a way that they can really count on. Mississippi and Alabama would have loved to have, where you have the Texas economy a little more diverse. You got cotton on one side and you got oil on the other, and they're both going to hold up Texas, and things are getting steadier. And in fact, oil's become so valuable by the late 1920s in the Texas economy that something amazing happens. In 1929, I want to point out the obvious, that's on the eve of the Great Depression. And in 1929, the value of oil production in Texas, as you guys can see, surpasses the value of cotton production for the first time in Texas history. This is the first time anything in Texas economy has been worth more than cotton since 1821. And what it means is the Texas economy is more diverse, it is more stable, all right? And it promises a big positive economic future for Texas. Things are going to be good, they think, in 1929. Oil is helping save our economy, stabilize it, more jobs. These new cities are going to be good. This is going to be good for all of us. Then, boom, the stock market crashes in October of 1929. And the bottom drops out absolutely everything. Depression will come across the entire United States. It will come to Texas in an absolutely devastating kind of way. But I wanted to set that up for all of us to understand what that moment really meant in 1929 when the market starts crashing, so we can understand why it's such a dramatic drop for Texas and why things will change so quickly in the 2 decades that are about to come. Okay? So I'm going to stop right there, and I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Michelle Phillips, who's going to take you guys through some materials to take this stuff into the classroom.
Hello, everybody. It's good to see everybody on this Monday morning. It's super rainy here, so I hope that it's not super rainy wherever you are. I've got a few things for you today. I really focused my lesson on progressivism and women's suffrage in Texas. And so I'm going to start with the hook exercise. I think Jay just posted that inside of the chat for you guys if you want to follow along. I see lots of people on there. Good. The hook exercise has 2 documents, a student document. I'm not going to go over all of that. That's just the printable version for the kiddos to take a look at. But what I want to show you is this. I grabbed this really great document that I use in my own classroom every year, and it's super fantastic. It's loading. 1 second. Actually, I've got it right here. Here you go. This document was created by the Texas Historical Commission, so it's for classroom use. And so I grabbed it for this hook exercise. What it does is has a really great, easy read article all about World War I and how it kind of capitalizes on Texas. And there's a great map for a super simple map analysis for the students, shows airfields and post-training camps. One thing that the article covers is how urbanization starts to happen because of these things that are being established inside of Texas. And it talks about the positive effects, but it also talks about the negative effects too, just as Andrew mentioned earlier. So this really sets the scene really well for progressivism in Texas. That's printable. I would say print it in color and use it as a classroom set. I've tried to print it in black and white and it doesn't work so well. So if you have the option to use an online version, do that. But if not, then print it in color. All right, let's see. I think I closed my stuff out just now. Here you go. Oh, there it is. All right, moving on to the suffrage stuff. So the suffrage, the women's suffrage movement is a big lesson. It's a suffrage inquiry. I want to walk you guys through that. There's two pieces to it. One of them is a PowerPoint presentation, and then the other is a printable student document. What I want to set this up as with is the fact that I did make this accessible for an online version. It is printable. There's one little brief news video inside of this, so that wouldn't be something that you could use in the inquiry if you decide to print it, or if you must print it. We don't have a one-to-one district, and so sometimes I don't have computer access. I don't know about you guys in your own classroom, but sometimes we do not. So if I had to print this, I would just remove the portion of the news clip. Okay, so what I've got for you is a couple of songs. There's the song cover and then the sheet music. Students are going to go through this along with their inquiry printouts and answer the questions. Basically, they're defining suffrage. My students don't typically come into my 7th grade class and know what suffrage means. And so really, I like to set the stage of defining suffrage, what it means, and then later on what it means for Texas, or what it looks like in Texas. I've got a few pictures, or one picture here actually, for them to take a look at. This is not in Texas. This is obviously in New York City. The resources for suffrage in Texas that promote suffrage is few and far between, but I would say that the resources that are against suffrage are really easy to find for Texas. Imagine that. I've got a few political cartoons because I love political cartoons, and so do my students. I would assume that yours do as well. They're really just asked to analyze these and choose one. Which one do they think promotes suffrage or progress best? And then I've got some newspaper articles for them to take a look at. These newspaper articles oppose suffrage in Texas, and so I want them to see really like both sides of the coin, and understand that, you know, women were battling against a lot of opposition. And then there's this really great ad that I found about it's a bank ad, and they're promoting women's suffrage, but they also want to make business off of women's suffrage. So of course that's super convenient to promote it in that way. Here's the little clip. I'm not going to play it for you. You guys can play that on your own. And then I've got the joint resolution bill inside of this for the students to analyze, which leads to the 19th Amendment of women's rights. And this very last little article right here is really fantastic. I absolutely love it, because this is when we've got to figure out what to call a woman governor. Do we call her governess or governor? And the article starts out saying, help, help. I can't figure this out, and I've got a story. And so that brings me to Ma Ferguson, or the influential Texas women. I picked 3. There's like a ton more, but I chose 3 influential women in Texas, and here's what they're going to look like. The students also have a piece on their handout for the influential women. If you want to just take this portion and separate it from the rest of it and not do the entire suffrage inquiry, you can do that as well. You can break it into pieces. Feel free. The first one that I chose is Jovita Aydar. She's one of the most amazing Tejano women in the early 1900s. She's not just a progressiveness for women, but she changes things for the entire Tejano and Tejana community all over South Texas and all over Texas, to be honest with you. She was an educator. She became a journalist after that. She quit her job as an educator because she was disgusted with the awful things that Mexican Americans faced in South Texas, the awful conditions. So she started writing about it. She got in trouble a little bit, and she stood her ground against the Texas Rangers and did some pretty cool things. So what I've got in here is just a quote from her. There's a newspaper article published by her, or published about her, not by her, I'm sorry. But this is a translated version. So if the words are a little bit tricky, you can change them up to make them make sense to your students. That's okay. Inside of the picture on the right-hand side, you can click, there's a link that goes to. It goes to like a separate website, and it gives some biography information. And then also Humanities Texas does this really fantastic thing for us. And there is it's called Texas Originals. The students can listen to her biography inside of that. This is fantastic for any of our lower learners that need to have the listening support as well. So anyways, all of that stuff is built in there, and it's pretty standard across the three women. So Bessie Coleman is the second woman I chose. She is amazing, fantastic, and brave. And my students absolutely adore her. So do I, for thousands of reasons. But she, this little newspaper article is all about this little Texas girl getting her pilot's license. And she's the very first African-American woman for the United States that was ever able to get it. So just like Bessie, just like the last one that I showed you, we've got a little audio clip right here, a quote from her, and another link for her biography information. And then the last person that I did was Ma Ferguson. She paved the way for women, right, in politics here in Texas. She may not be the most stand-up person on the face of this earth. There's plenty of arguments for that, to support that, but nonetheless, I use her to teach with. She's in our TEKS, so we've got to hit all of our TEKS. All of these women are in our TEKS, by the way, and so her information is very standard as well. This is an interesting clip that I found. It was in a French newspaper. They were talking all about how she was one of the first women governors in the United States, and so I just thought it was really cool that they were talking about her all the way overseas. So again, more information about her. The student document really goes hand in hand with this. And you can break it up. You can do the whole thing, or you can just do a tiny little portion of it. And then the very last piece that I've got is this exit ticket. This is all about the child labor conditions in the United States. What I did was used a picture. Andrew actually showed it to you guys in one of his slides. I grabbed a picture, and I also put the current child labor laws of the United States on the right-hand side so that they could really compare and contrast what this picture looks like versus what the United States says now to protect our kids. A lot of kids don't know what the current child labor laws are. They don't necessarily work, but they just don't know that there's specific laws to protect them. And so what they've got at the very bottom are just analysis questions to compare and contrast what they see in the picture versus what our laws are today. So that is all I've got for you guys. I'm going to stop sharing and hand it back to Andrew.
Well, thank you, Michelle. I just want to say real fast, it's a joy to work with Jay and Michelle, because I guess a professional historian that works at university, I'm not in the classroom where you guys are, but getting to work with these two to translate these materials and bring into the classroom so that the stuff is ready and able to be used in all kinds of ways. As Michelle just said, you guys can take pieces of that, pieces you guys will. You guys are obviously innovators in your own world. I just think it's a really amazing thing. All of this stuff, I know you know this, is up on the Google Classroom, and it's made accessible to all you however you want, and you can use it and run with it however you need. We're out of time because the first day always runs a little long. So we'll have time for questions in future sessions.